We're breaking into programming to go to Israel, where the parliament has approved the first part of controversial judicial changes. It includes limiting the power of Supreme Court judges. This bill forms part of a wider package of changes that protesters have been out on the streets demonstrating against all year. Critics say the bill is a threat to democracy.
So, yeah, that's in Israel. Today, the far-right Israeli government voted to limit the power of the country's Supreme Court. We'll get into why and what that means later, but there have been massive protests throughout the country over this. Critics are saying that the move is a power grab by Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, who may be hoping to force through far-right-wing laws, but also there's selfishness there too, because he might be trying to shield himself from that very court. We're going to talk about that policy in a little bit, but let's take a look, Cenk, at some of these protests and how massive they are in a country as small as Israel.
You can hear the anger on the streets. The vote in the Israeli parliament just taking place. Protesters not able to get near the parliament because of the police, but protesters spilling right down the roads.
Earlier, angry crowds massing near the Israeli parliament. Police carrying away protesters and firing water cannon to disperse crowds overnight. This weekend, former Israeli security chiefs signing a letter backing a threat from thousands of army reservists, saying they'll no longer serve when the reforms go through. And before today's crucial vote, President Biden wading in, releasing a statement calling on Israeli leaders to seek consensus and not rush their, quote, divisive judicial reforms. Protesters descending on Jerusalem from all over the country, many marching for days, some camping outside the parliament, saying today's vote is wrecking Israeli democracy.
I mean, two unbelievably unprecedented facts in that report. One is that army reservists are threatening not to serve. The Israeli army, as we know, it's mandatory for Israeli citizens to serve, and the notion that they would step away from that, which is a source of real national pride, a little different in each country, but in Israel, certainly national pride, that is surprising, Cenk. Also, the fact that a U.S. president is admonishing Israel and Netanyahu in the way that he did. Let's take a look at why these people are protesting, why there's such grave concern about these laws. Israel, the country, doesn't have a formal constitution, so the nation's high court uses the subjective legal standard of, quote, reasonableness to assess whether a law should stand. The Netanyahu government's judicial overhaul would restrict the Supreme Court's use of reasonableness in striking down laws, appointments, and other actions. So, just to talk about that for 1 second. So when legislation comes over, there is this level of reasonableness. And if the court had thought that it was unreasonable of the legislature in an extreme way to legislate in the way they did, the court could step in. Well, now they can't. At least that's what Netanyahu wanted, and that's what the note said, the vote said in the Knesset. We'll continue. Netanyahu himself has argued that the Supreme Court has become an insular, elitist group that does not represent the Israeli people. But critics say Netanyahu is pushing the overhaul forward in part to protect himself from his own corruption trial, where he faces charges of fraud, bribery, and a breach of trust. And of course, he denies any wrongdoing. And it's what this is able to do, aside from Netanyahu protecting himself, is to have the far right in Israel push through all of their policies, even if a court that would ordinarily have the right to deem them reasonable or not were to deem them unreasonable. Doesn't matter if these ultimately go through, and if in fact this vote holds. Of course, there'll be challenges to it. But Cenk, that is a massive change in government there, and you have the U.S. chiming in against it.
Yeah, so let me give a sense of the enormity of this, impact of this law, and then we'll talk through what are the consequences and why it's happened. So first, since Israel doesn't have a constitution, as Michael explained, this is the way that the judiciary checks an out of control parliament, right? And so they don't use that willy-nilly. They have a standard, and this is the normal checks and balances that you would find in a democracy, right? But without it, this is the really important part. Just a slim majority of the ruling party can get anything passed now. Okay, so there's no check at all. There'll be no judiciary check. And in the case of Israel, since it's a parliamentary system, the prime minister and the ruling party are close to the same thing. And in this particular case, at this point in time in Israel, they are the same thing. So whatever Netanyahu decides just becomes immediately the law of the land. Now, is it immediate? No, they go to vote on it in Knesset, but he's gonna win those votes. And then the judiciary can't do anything about it. And so people are very justifiably concerned that that means you don't have a democracy anymore. Now, it's complicated because democracies have a lot of different components, including elections, but part of that is a separation of powers, or a different part of democracy is a separation of powers, minority rights, etc. Here, even if you think, well, they're still gonna have elections, they can vote out Netanyahu, at a bare minimum, this means that democracy as we know it in the West has taken a massive hit in Israel. And so, look, the US system has, in my opinion, too many checks and balances, and it creates too much friction. So even if you win giant majorities, you still can't get anything done because not only is there the Supreme Court, which I think of course should exist and should have the check that it does, but on top of that, you have ridiculous things that have no business and are not in the Constitution, like the filibuster, the parliamentarian, etc., and it grinds everything to a halt. So you don't want things ground to a halt, but you don't want a simple majority to be able to run roughshod over the rest of the country with no checks and balances, and that's where Israel is partly heading. Now, look, I think that when you look at the normal explanations as to why, you will see that, as with a lot of countries, it is secular folks versus fundamentalist religious folks. And this happened, for example, in my home country of Turkey, and the fundamentalists won. And look, if that faction wins, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a democracy, everybody can win. They could be as right wing as they like, they could be as religious as they like. The problem with fundamentalists is that they refuse to leave. And so we saw a piece of that here in Donald Trump and backed by the Christian nationalists, etc. Because fundamentalists, not all religious folks, but I'm talking about fundamentalists, think, I don't really care about your democracy. I just care about my religion. That's why I'm a fundamentalist. I think my religion rules over everything, and I find everything else an inconvenience to my path to power. So now there are less inconveniences to their path to power for fundamentalist religious folks in Israel. There's also the extra nuance of Ashkenazi Jews versus Mizrahi Jews. Ashkenazi are from Europe, Mizrahi are generally speaking from the Middle East and Asia. And they both came together in Israel, and Ashkenazi Jews for a long time were the ruling elite in Israel. And they built up some resentment, rightfully or wrongly. I'm more on the secular side, so but I'm sure that there were things that the ruling elite in Israel should not have done to all of the folks in Israel, and that built up more and more resentment. But overall, the fundamentalists were gonna do what they were gonna do no matter what. And I think that it hurts us to be naive in all of these countries that are affected by this phenomenon. I also think that once you start getting used to taking away people's rights, and Israel got very, very used to taking away Palestinian rights, then it becomes a little easier to take away other people's rights. And in fact, Michael, I mean, this is of course an extreme example, but one of the papers did write that the fundamentalist folks that were happening to be Mizrahi were yelling at some of the Ashkenazi Jews saying, we wish the Holocaust had done more because it mainly affected the Ashkenazi Jews. And so that sent a chill down my spine, and I can't believe one Jewish person said that to another, but that's where we are today.
Well, it's fascinating that everybody within Israel, and I think outside of Israel, worries about the threats to Israel from outside, that Israel could potentially be destroyed. But in fact, Israel is now getting closer to, they're certainly in a rhetorical civil war, but when you have army reservists refusing to serve, the problems in Israel and the bringing down of Israel could happen because of Israel amongst themselves before it happens from an outside source. Again, that's taking it too far, but they are really at a boiling point in that country, and it's not a very big country, and it's a very militarized country. And another part of it, we talked about how Netanyahu considers the Supreme Court elitist and insular, so he doesn't want to defer to them. But what does that make him, right? I mean, that makes him somebody who is almost dictatorial because of this law. Do you read it that way?
Yeah, of course, it's just an excuse. And so, yeah, and Netanyahu will do anything for power. And so there's the paradox that, by the way, Netanyahu is Ashkenazi, but he's largely backing the Mizrahis. And it doesn't break along those lines perfectly at all. Every country, their internal politics is a mess, filled with tons of different factions and infighting, etc. But generally speaking, it is the more religious folks against the more secular folks. And Netanyahu came from the secular branch and is now siding with both ultra-religious folks and ultra-nationalist folks. Watch out for people with ultra at the beginning of their description.
And we have to continue a little bit here because you talked on the minorities, and I think it's important that we mention this, that while the Israeli Supreme Court, this is more from Jake Johnson at Common Dreams, while the Israeli Supreme Court has been an extremely weak check on the government's systematic oppression of Palestinians and illegal land confiscations, the proposed judicial overhaul could completely eliminate any remaining barriers to far-right efforts to dramatically expand settlements and further roll back Palestinian rights. And this goes to the whole conversation around reasonableness and what someone like Netanyahu and his faction in the Knesset deems reasonable, which a Supreme Court that is not legislative and is not elected directly could step in and check that. It's also important, I think we point out, that this is not unique to Israel. This is in the United Kingdom, this is in Australia. This reasonableness idea, and we have to remember that when Israel was formed in 1948, there was a lot of British influence and a lot of parliamentary influence in how this was done. Reasonableness being in the United Kingdom, reasonableness now a big part of, or I guess a diminished part of Israeli law.
Yeah, and one more thing. Look, and I'm curious what your opinion on this is. So my prediction is the US will huff and puff, and Biden sent that, statement for what it's worth. And Michael's right that it's a little extraordinary. The US president normally never ever criticizes Israel, so a little bit. But my guess is that's where they'll leave it, and this won't affect the funding of Israel 1%. And they could have as ultra-religious leadership as they want. It could be as ultra-fundamentalist as they want, and they can take away any rights they like. And we're never going to touch $1 of Israel's funding. So that's my guess, and I think that's disastrous. I think that things like this, you help a friend by putting pressure on them, as France and other allies did for us during the Iraq war. It didn't work, but they at least did their part and tried to get us to not do something that was going to be terribly damaging to ourselves, let alone the allies in the world. And I think that we have plenty of leverage here, the United States does, but I'm gonna guess that we're gonna choose to not exert any of it. I think we should exert all of it. That's the part I'm not sure I know what you think, Michael. What's your sense of whether Israel's funding here should be at play to push them back in the right direction?
Well, I don't know that the funding is going to be in play on this. I don't know that the funding will ever be in play, frankly. I kind of agree with you on that point, unless there is an aggression, a massive aggression like we haven't seen in Palestine, the occupied territories. I don't see this. This seems like it is opining about an internal debate that's happening inside another democracy, and I don't think that the United States would step in that way. They haven't stepped in because of Palestine either, let's be clear. But again, if there was something massive and different than what we've seen, I think that's the only time that we would see that happen. But first of all, we should say that this is going to be challenged, right? I mean, so when Netanyahu comes to visit the White House in the fall, he's already been invited. President Herzog met with President Biden last week at the White House. These things are going to come up, but this is not the major point of conversation, I'm guessing, that they're going to have, Netanyahu and Biden. There are plenty of things on which they disagree. And I think Biden is going to be a little different of an audience. I mean, he's been cold to Netanyahu so far, and he did issue this, I would say admonition, mild admonition on this. But I don't think it's going to be about funding because of this. But the protests continue now, and they didn't end with the vote. And the vote was a shutout, by the way, 64-0, because everybody who would have voted against it saw the writing on the wall and decided to just walk out of the Knesset, which is pretty unheard of. The other part of that is, that Israel's Supreme Court, ironically, may be able to take this up if it's challenged. And then it becomes up to Netanyahu and his government as to whether or not they will actually entertain or respect the ruling of the Supreme Court that they have taken the power from already. So it's a lot of irony going on there as well.
Yeah, and then there's one other shoe to drop, and I love these kind of internal protests of any country that's trying to make sure they hold on to their rights. Over 1,000 people in the Israeli Defense Forces, specifically the Air Force, had threatened to quit if they pass this law, and they have passed the law. So we're going to see if they are going to quit. If they do in mass, Israel's Air Force would be greatly depleted, at least for the moment being. And people are concerned about it. Yes.
We have to underscore how sort of military abdication in Israel is just unprecedented. And that, I think, speaks to the rest of the world and speaks to Knesset members who may have been on the fence more than anything will, more than funding even from the United States will within the confines of Israel.
Okay, now I'm going to say something slightly obnoxious. Yeah, the more educated are more likely to be Air Force pilots. And so, sorry, well, religious fundamentalists should look into an education. Okay, and if you didn't, and the Air Force says, we don't want to participate in this because it's no longer a democracy, and you're taking away my rights, why am I participating in that? I say, here, go get them, brothers. And so, I think that's a terrific protest, partly because it might be successful. And now, they threatened it. Will they deliver? We don't know. How many of them will deliver? We don't know. And look, in the short term, the threat to Israel's security is overblown if those pilots don't show up. Why? Because the Palestinians don't have an Air Force, and no one else is going to do a damn thing about it. So it would be a good symbolic move at a bare minimum, I think. But that's easy for me to say. I'm not in their situation. Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.